I want to start as I was taught by an elder in Saskatchewan, to acknowledge the spirits of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to welcome them. I also honor the courage of survivors of violence, and I raise my hands to the strength of the 2S LGBTQIA people. Elders, firekeepers, Mika, thank you. Drummers and singers, thank you for joining us today. I thank also the Algonquin Anishinaabe people for welcoming us today to their unsurrendered land. Good morning, bon matin, tanse. Families, friends, honored guests, thank you for joining us today. This is a big day for all of us. It is indeed an honor for me to serve as Chief Commissioner in this historic national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In over 2 years of public hearings and evidence gathering from coast to coast to coast, we listened to the truths of more than 2,380 family members, survivors of violence, experts, and knowledge keepers. My sincere thanks to all of you who shared your truths. Your truths now cannot be unheard. You have started to rewrite Canadian history in a good way. Thank you. I also want to thank the communities all across Canada who welcomed us with open arms and with trust, with wisdom, and on occasion a little bit of a hard lesson. So thank you to all the people who welcomed us. To parents, family members, families of the heart, who must live with that ongoing ache of grief and loss. To anyone who has lost a loved one suddenly, we wrap you here today in love, hope, and kinship. Just as our grandmothers, who you met by video, have wrapped us in our love, in their love, their hope, their wisdom. Thank you, grandmothers. I want to point out that while we were having all of these public hearings across Canada, at the same time, our research team was working very hard. They thoroughly analyzed existing studies, texts, and articles, and they carefully reviewed all of the evidence that we commissioners heard. This morning, my dear colleagues, my fellow commissioners, and I are sharing a brief summary of the final report. It'll be a little more thorough than what you've read in the press. Yes, our mandate is our mandate is to report on the systemic underlying historical causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and to make recommendations to make change so that we can all live in a safe and prosperous country. So today, the commissioners and I hold up a mirror to Canada. We reflect back what we have heard and what we have documented. I want to start by explaining some of the underlying principles or guiding thoughts that we had when we started to write our final report. These principles underlie our findings of fact and our calls for justice. And these principles must guide the implementation of our calls for justice. Calls for justice are not mere recommendations or optional suggestions. They are legal imperatives. Governments must fully implement the calls for justice to ensure the safety and dignity of Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people. They are calls for justice because that is what you, families and survivors, told us that you want. Justice. These principles, as I've said, must guide the implementation of our calls for justice in order for them to be effective, for them to be something more than Band-Aid measures. First, there must be substantive equality. Now, substantive equality means achievement of true equality in outcomes. Next, Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQIA people, are holders of inherent Indigenous rights, constitutional rights, and international and domestic human rights. Issues must be reframed from unfilled needs to the denial of their basic rights. Implementation must also use a decolonizing approach that recognizes these inherent rights. Further, implementation must use a strength-based approach, focusing on the resilience and the expertise of individuals and communities. At all stages of implementation, families and survivors must be included. Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQI people must always be at the table. Based on the evidence that we heard, we believe in the importance of self-determination and Indigenous-led solutions and services. So, planning and delivery of services and solutions must be led by Indigenous governments, organizations, and Indigenous people. Distinctions within Indigenous communities in terms of self-identification, geographical location, and residency must be acknowledged and respected. Further, implementation must always be viewed through a gendered lens. Implementation of our calls for justice must ensure cultural safety. Interpretation and implementation requires services and processes that empower Indigenous people. Trauma-informed approaches must always be used. That's almost a given now. So see, already, it's a little more detailed than what you've read in the media. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of our report. The findings and calls for justice are grouped as overarching, and then those concerning health, culture, security, and justice. We have addressed Inuit, Métis, and 2S LGBTQIA issues with additional calls for justice. And we have a report, findings of fact, and calls for justice for the province of Quebec. Turning now to the overarching findings of fact. And these are findings of fact that are comprehensive and large and general in scope. First, the significant, persistent, and deliberate pattern of systemic racial and gendered human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses perpetuated historically and maintained today by the Canadian state, designed to displace Indigenous people from their lands, social structures, and governance, and to eradicate their existence as nations, communities, families, and individuals, is the cause of the disappearances, murders, and violence experienced by Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people, and this is genocide. This colonialism, this discrimination, and this genocide explains the high rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people. An absolute paradigm shift is required to dismantle colonialism in Canadian society. And this paradigm shift must come from all levels of government and public institutions. Ideologies and instruments of colonialism, racism and misogyny, both past and present, must be rejected. Canada has signed and ratified many international declarations and treaties that, at least on paper, protect Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people and their rights and safety. But Canada has failed to meaningfully implement the provisions of these declarations and treaties. Further, there is no accessible and reliable mechanism in Canada for Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people to seek recourse and remedies for the violations of their domestic and international human rights and Indigenous rights. And the Canadian legal system fails to hold the state and state actors accountable for these violations. Over time, the Canadian state has displaced Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people from their traditional roles in governance and leadership and continues to violate their political rights. We, the Commissioners, recognize self-determination and self-government as fundamental human and Indigenous rights and a best practice. Efforts by Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQIA people to be self-determining and to be respected face significant barriers, especially in the area of funding and support. Temporary and deficit-based approaches do not increase capacity for determination or self-governance. And such approaches, as we already know, fail to provide protection and safety, as well as substantive equality. Those are our overarching findings of fact, based on what the families and survivors told us. Turning now to our calls for justice, because that's what the families and survivors told us they want. In our report, the terminology all governments means Indigenous, federal, provincial, and territorial governments. We have 231 calls for justice that are directed not only at governments. We have included calls for justice that all Canadians can act on, because we, the Commissioners and myself, see the solutions to this national tragedy as including all Canadians. We all are the solution. So here are the calls. All governments, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, shall develop and implement a national action plan to address violence against Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people. All governments, with the full participation of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, shall fully implement and comply with all relevant international and human Indigenous rights, treaties, and instruments. All governments, in meeting human and Indigenous rights obligations, must prioritize and resource the measures to eliminate the social, economic, cultural, and political marginalization of Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people. All governments, and in particular Indigenous governments and Indigenous representative organizations, must take urgent and special measures to ensure that Indigenous women and girls, too, as LGBTQIA people, are represented in governments and that their political rights are upheld. Further, those governments must equitably support the role of Indigenous women and girls and too, as LGBTQIA people in governance and leadership. All governments shall immediately take all necessary measures to prevent, investigate, punish, and compensate for violence against Indigenous women and girls, too, as LGBTQIA people. Further, all governments must eliminate jurisdictional gaps and violence that result in the denial of services or improperly regulated and delivered services that address the social, economic, political, and cultural marginalization of and violence against Indigenous women and girls, too, as LGBTQIA people. Federal, provincial, and territorial governments, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, shall establish a national Indigenous and human rights ombudsperson and tribunal. All governments shall create specific and long-term funding available to Indigenous communities and organizations to create, deliver, and disseminate prevention, education, and awareness campaigns to address violence prevention and combating lateral violence. All governments shall develop laws, policies, and public education to challenge the acceptance and the horrendous normalization of violence. The federal government shall create an independent mechanism to report on the implementation of these calls for justice to Parliament, and that reporting shall be annually. And because our women and girls are lost but not forgotten, we have called upon the federal government, specifically the Privy Council Office and Library and Archives Canada, to maintain and make easily accessible our public record and website. And for all Canadians, we have calls for justice for you too. And I'm just going to name a few of them. First, read our report. Speak out against racism, sexism, and misogyny. Hold governments to account. And decolonize yourself by learning about Indigenous peoples and the true history of Canada. In conclusion, the steps to end and redress this genocide must be no less monumental than the combination of systems and actions that have worked to maintain colonial violence for generations. A permanent commitment to ending the genocide requires addressing the four pathways that we have explored in our report. First, the historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational, probably international now too, trauma. Second, social and economic marginalization. Third, maintaining status quo and lack of institutional will. And finally, our last pathway, ignoring the agency and the expertise of Indigenous women and girls and to us LGBTQ people. The murders, the abductions, the human trafficking, the beatings, the rapes, the violence, and yes, the genocide will continue unless all Canadians find the strength, courage, and vision to build a new, decolonized relationship with each other based on respect and self-determination. Let us walk together. Let us work together. We must do this together to achieve our destiny as strong, proud people in this great nation. Thank you all.